Hello, everybody, and welcome to another conversation on the Nietzsche podcast. And I am here with Craig from Acid Horizon. I did an appearance on that show a little while ago now where we talked about Heraclitus and Nietzsche. Everyone should go check that out. I had a lot of fun. And I thought it would be good to get Craig on to talk about a completely different topic, but one that I'm very excited about. David Lynch, Deleuze and Guattari, schizoanalysis, and Eraserhead. But before we get into any of that, Craig, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. It's really good to be here. And I should say that I am a longtime listener and a first-time caller of sorts. But I'll have you know that this past summer, you were in my headset every time I mowed the lawn.
Oh, that's great. That's a common thing that I hear from a lot of people as well. It's like daily walks, doing chores, stuff like that. I mean, that's the best use for a podcast. It's found time. But yeah, before we get into the meat of this, I wanted to ask you about your background, what led you into philosophy, how Acid Horizon got started, all of those things.
Sure. Yeah, I guess my introduction to philosophy is not unlike a lot of people of my generation. So I was a teenager in the 90s, and it was at a time where like Taoism and Buddhism was popular, and I had some older friends who were kind of into that sort of thing. And, we were all doing things like martial arts. And of course, there's this, idealization of Eastern culture and also a little bit of the influence of the 60s, Jack Kerouac, Ginsberg, and the Beat Generation all brought to bear on that initial interest. And then when I finished high school, I was a bit lost and I was like, what am I going to do? So I ended up enrolling in community college, and one of the first courses I took was philosophy. And so it was kind of up in the air initially as to whether or not I would go into studying psychology or philosophy. And I am one of those people who did stick with their major, I guess, all the way through until the very end. I went to Penn State University. And I mean, I was very naive about my approach to philosophy initially. I will say that my experience reading things like the Tao Te Ching, Buddhist texts like the Dhammapada, and were formative and influential. But it wasn't really until I got to Penn State that I had, well, my very first, like third year class that I took was Nietzsche and Kierkegaard. And I remember sitting in that particular class, and we were just going through the syllabus. And my teacher at the time was Charles Scott, who was he's well known for Nietzsche, Foucault, and Heidegger. And there was just something about the rhythm, pace, and delivery of his initial lecture that really grabbed me. And I could feel in those very moments some of my long-standing beliefs about religion and God and things like just slipping away, just hearing about Nietzsche, not even really getting into the meat of it. And so that was the sort of initial toe dip, if you will. But during my time there, I did more with existentialism, post-structuralism. At the time, Derrida was quite popular and so forth. And I would say just the general sphere of left Heideggerianism was kind of in the air at that time. And then I went overseas and I taught in Japan for a few years. And it was during that time that I took a little bit of a wrong turn or a right turn, I guess. And this will be important in today's conversation, into figures like Carl Jung, and particularly the post-psychoanalyst James Hillman. While I was in Japan, I had a year where I had intense and profound dreams to the point, and I was not interested in my dreams hardly at all. I had some, what Carl Jung would call big dreams early on in my life, but it never occurred to me that that would be a subject of study or focus. And it was by virtue of having these dreams that I decided I need to see a therapist or something just to get the intensity down on these dreams and to go over a bit of the content. And it was during that time I started delving into the work of Jung, but actually more so James Hillman, who, there has been some work done by figures like Grant Maxwell to sort of make a connection between Deleuze and Hillman's work. And so it's a sort of burgeoning area of research and post-psychoanalysis. And then after that, there was a lull where I went into music for a long time, and I think at one time I actually shared with you my old prog metal band that I was a part of for more than 10 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, I did a lot I did shows with, some famous new metal acts. I was actually, kind of friendly with the guys from Alien Ant Farm for a while. Like an early version of the band used to play with System of a Down, and actually used to play with shows with their former drummer and that sort of thing. But what we were doing was not new metal at all. It was kind of out there and doing our own sort of thing. But during that time, I think my academic interest took a back seat. But it was then in the era of Occupy Wall Street and so forth that I became a little bit more politically involved. And it was during that time that I started looking at more closely, figures like Karl Marx and, the Frankfurt School and so forth. And while I was at Penn State, I actually encountered Deleuze very briefly in the course on Nietzsche, but it was coming back to Deleuze after a stint of doing some political activism. And it's really hard to explain because rarely would I cite having a sort of spiritual experience of sorts. But it was actually while reading chapter 2 of the Genealogy of Morals one day.
That is a crazy book to have a spiritual
Yeah,
experience with.
exactly. Well, I don't know. I would call it an unbinding, a materialist unbinding. And in fact, I felt an actual physical sensation of like my sternum opening. It was just a very sort of unusual experience that I had. But just the challenges of like working and living in Los Angeles, being a musician, and all the emotions that had gone into it, and all of the sort of emotional, I guess you would say, unaddressed traumas of the past. I had had cancer. That was another thing too during that time, and I had used a portion of my student loan to pay for my operation because my work. I was let go from my work because I was sick from cancer, and they thought I was faking it. But anyway, um, so I didn't have any insurance, and so in the course of all of that, it was this sort of second encounter with Nietzsche where I just had this sort of revelation of sorts. And that was around the same time I started getting back into Deleuze and Guattari. And it was actually in a reading group in a socialist party that I was part of, where we were reading all sorts of stuff. Gosh, we were Angela Davis, Moise Postone. And then one day I remember it was announced, they said, we're going to read a little bit of Anti-Oedipus. This stuff is going to be weird. A lot of people might not like it. And I remember on the day of the reading group, nobody showed up for it. Uh,
Wow.
and I was absolutely jazzed to have read this. And so that day was fateful because I think there was like a day or two after that, I had gone up to Portland and popped into Powell's up there. And there it was sitting on the shelf, a used copy of Anti-Oedipus for $7.95. And I'm like, oh, there it is, pick it up. And it was at that moment I decided I am going to go back to grad school. And I was actually already working at a university teaching college prep and intensive English to foreign students who were visiting. And so it was my privilege as a full-time employee doing that to utilize the Cal State system to take courses. And I thought, well, what I can do is I can chart a course to eventually get a master's degree in philosophy if I take night classes and things like that. And I reached out to all kinds of professors there. And there was one professor who's now a good friend of mine, Jay Conway. Jay Conway had done his PhD on Deleuze. And at that time, and it's probably still the case, but Cal State is a heavily analytic philosophy school. And so with Jay and some other friends, we kind of formed an undercommons there where I was able to do a master's thesis on Deleuze and Kafka. I guess as far as my formal training philosophy, that's the general history. But then a few short months after that, we had something called COVID-19, hit our
I've never heard of that. What is
yeah,
that?
exactly. There was, I had been working at the LA County, in the LA County jail system, and I was teaching English. I was also teaching some philosophy courses, some ethics courses, philosophy of law. I had my master's at that time, but given the intensity and the prospect of maybe not going back to work, nobody knew what was happening during the pandemic, and certainly in custody or supermax prison is no place to be during a pandemic of that type. So it was uncertain as to what was going to happen, but fortunately I was still getting paid. And it was during that time I thought, well, I listen to a lot of podcasts. Let me try my hand. Let me do like 3 episodes or something like that. But at that time, a bunch of us had formed this reading group online, this Anti-Oedipus reading group. And in the context of that reading group, I had made some friends, and I was like, "Hey, do you guys want to record this little podcast idea that we have?" And I think by virtue of the fact that we had a rapt audience, everybody glued to their computer chair at home during the pandemic, we were able to catch eyes and ears, and that's how Acid Horizon came about. And essentially, the rest is history. And since then, we've been going strong. I created something called the Philosopher's Tarot. I had received a contract through Zero Books and Repeater. Actually, it's Repeater Books to create this tarot deck that I had envisioned just by some memes that I created in my free time. I made, and in fact, I made Felix Gattari as the magician, and I put it out online, and somebody said, "Well, when are you going to do the rest of those cards?" And I was like, "I'm not. There is no way in hell I am making a full deck." And I did a couple more, just as a joke. And then once I developed a relationship with Repeater Books and Zero Books, I kind of threw this idea at them. I was like, "Hey, my friend Terry Goddard, I was like, what do you think of doing something like a tarot deck of philosophers?" And they loved the idea, and they put it out. And since then, we had another publication, Anti-Oculus, A Philosophy of Escape, that came out in 2022. But since then, we have left the imprint for reasons that are known on the internet. You can find them. It could be a potentially litigious matter, so I'll leave it to other people, to sort of get into Google and see what you can find as to why Acid Horizon, or at least me anyway, why I'm no longer doing anything with Repeater Books and Zero Books. But that said, our podcast is still going strong. I also have another solo podcast, actually somewhat influenced by you, Keegan. I really liked
Oh,
your
wow.
yeah, I really liked your long form format, and one of the things, all of the sort of production activities, that aspect of doing a podcast began to overwhelm me to the point that I didn't have a lot of time to do my own personal research. And one of the things I really envied about you was is that in these long monologues that you did, I could tell that there was a lot of rich engagement with these texts, and I wanted to do something similar with things that I was personally interested in, but didn't feel that I wanted to replay ad nauseum on the Acid Horizon channel. So I developed something called Left Hand, and it's there that I decided to get into my interest in psychology, psychoanalysis, its intersection with politics. I even did a little bit of alchemy, and I just listened to your episode on psychology and alchemy. So that was kind of a nice, like, oh yeah, there's some overlap between what Keegan and I are doing. But
Well, and it's funny you mentioned having all these very vivid dreams and studying Jung and Hillman at the same time. That it's right when I'm doing the episode on psychology and alchemy, and the second part of that's going to cover the dream study that makes up a large part of that work. And the funny thing about studying Jung, I've had all sorts of very intense dreams just by reading about all of these dreams, and maybe somebody could make the argument that I'm like seeding my unconsciousness with Jungian imagery, and maybe that's why. But it was just funny. That's a little bit of Jungian synchronicity there, I guess. And it's funny too that maybe another synchronous thing is that so many other people that I talk to who are interested in philosophy are also musicians.
yeah,
And also that we had a similar path with the Nietzsche podcast, basically starting like I've sometimes talked about how the initial form of it was really a book club on Discord that we
oh,
set up to talk about Nietzsche. We would get together on voice chat, however many people could make it, and talk about a chapter at a time. And it was one of those things where a lot of people said, "You explain this really well, and you have a good voice, so you should try starting a podcast." It's one of those similar kind of attitude of like, "Well, let's just see what happens with this," and
yeah,
I'm glad that I did. But
yeah.
yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the centrality of Deleuze and Anti-Oedipus to your journey, because that's kind of the first thing I wanted to ask you about. Anti-Oedipus it's a massive text, not necessarily in terms of length, but in terms of just the fecundity of concepts
Mm.
in that work. I would say for myself, I find a lot that's very contentious in Anti-Oedipus that I don't necessarily agree with, even though I see like the merit of a lot of those ideas. Maybe just to start out, from your perspective, what are some of the ideas in the Anti-Oedipus, particularly the critiques of psychoanalysis, that were, sort of those bombshell moments for you that kind of blew things open?
Well, to be honest, I was initially attracted to the allure of the language and just the subject matter itself, which was dealing with the intersection of, well, I mean, I had some interest in Freudo-Marxism and always felt a kind of tension there, but I really appreciated the idea or the project of picking up these kind of Nietzschean predicates to go after Freud and also, vindicate part of Marx and bring that all together. But I think there was also, I was reflecting on it earlier today, and this is not a thought that had occurred to me actually until today. I think one of the reasons that I wanted to stay with that text was something that I couldn't articulate at the time, which has to do with what I think Anti-Oedipus is up to precisely, which is this attack on representational thinking. And having been so long inured to the notion of representational thinking, I mean, think about it, even in American high schools, I don't know how your experience was in your high school English classes, but just the emphasis on symbolism, analogy, and so on and so forth. It's something that's
Hmm.
indoctrinated into us. And then
It's almost like the sole content of what they want you to do.
exactly, absolutely, absolutely. And then getting to Carl Jung, and then looking at like Jung's work. Now, I mean, Hillman counts himself as a Jungian, and I think he does much to honor and vindicate Jung's work. But I think there is something fundamentally different happening within Jung, or he's picking up on something that Jung's doing, like in the Red Book, for example. He's emphasizing Jung's psychology over Jung's metaphysics. And that was something that I always tapped into, and perhaps the reason that I gravitated more towards Hillman's work. I see Deleuze and Guattari doing very much the same thing, taking a similar line of attack on psychoanalysis, and representational thinking broadly construed. And I mean, I have a lot of notes on this, but I guess I'll stop there.
Well, like as an example, the famous one from Freud. Well, most people know the quote of him saying, "Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar," but the
Right.
inverse of that is that the cigar is a phallic symbol. Freud is always sort of looking to a cynical reading would be to reduce a lot of what might seem to be innocuous or non-sexual events or happenings or thoughts, feelings, so on and so forth, to something that actually it represents a sexual desire.
Sure.
And that was an interesting aspect to me about Anti-Oedipus, is the whole, how would you say, just the idea that the unconsciousness is not, it's not attempting to communicate about repressed contents.
Mm.
It's not that the consciousness has hidden all these things from you, and the unconscious is trying to symbolize what's being hidden. On the one hand, I'm very attracted to that idea because it's sort of like a rethinking of the unconscious as an active place and rethinking of desire as something active, which I think is a very interesting idea, and it is a very Nietzschean inspired idea.
Mhm.
Not seeing desire as a lack, and not seeing, consciousness as something lacking that the unconscious is like compensating for by giving us these symbols. On the other hand, though, I think I'm ambivalent or I'm agnostic to the extent which I actually believe that myself. Because in my own experience, I think a lot of people I know or have known, and even myself, do have repressed contents of their
Sure.
unconsciousness.
Sure.
So I don't know. How do you think about all of those sort of
Well,
issues?
I will admit, as much as I cleave to the Deleuzian side of things, I see an incredible wealth of knowledge and conceptual strength in psychoanalysis. I mean, particularly the concept of projection, for example, which is something that Deleuze and Guattari go after. But I think it is with good reason, because I think what they want to say is we don't want to be reductive about psychology in a way that returns things to a theater of representation. And they want to see how these, how the emergence of psychological content is tied into a broader social field of determinants. And so, like, whenever I feel like I want to make a U-turn back into my psychoanalytical commitments, I kind of remind myself of that. And maybe another way to elucidate how I see Deleuze and Guattari as useful as addressing this problem is, I think in some ways, and I'd love to hear your opinion on this. I think Jungian psychology is an improvement on Freud in many fronts. I think its description of libido is much richer, and I think it's truer to the sort of Latinate term libido, and it's more encompassing in its definition. But not only that, just the polyvalence of the unconscious, the appearance of archetypal figures and so forth. But a problem that Hillman notes, for example, in the psychoanalytic tradition, is that it became very much like Oedipal Freudianism, in that they would valorize the figure of the great mother. And there was this tendency, for example, to reify the archetypes in a way that was prohibitive of thinking about the movement of psyche in these sort of creative ways that acknowledges, for example, processes of differentiation, the very specificity of images, and the ways in which things become new. And I think one of the appeals of Jungian thinking is that it offers this sense that archetypal thought is stable, and that we can make recourse to the figure of the hero, for example, or the shadow. But often, I think the phenomenal experience of our lives is in excess of that, and that's where I think folks like Hillman and Deleuze and Guattari are a bit more useful in some sense. And maybe as we sort of hold these figures in our as we hold court with them, so to speak, philosophically throughout our lives, people like you and me and people who listen to our respective podcasts, I think there's always going to be a tension there, right? There's
Yeah.
never going to be a full reconciliation between Freud, Jung, Deleuze, and Guattari, and so forth.
Right, and that's actually a very important thing to point out about Jung, because it is the centrality of the mother figure and the father figure and the child figure still appears in Jung.
Right.
It's Jung would have said that he was transcending Freud's sort of narrow focus in many ways, but many of the key things that they're criticizing in Anti-Oedipus is that sort of the binding of that family structure, basically.
Mhm.
As basically constituting the structure of desire. Jung does seem to break out of that in many ways, and yet, as you point out, there is something to me that's probably the part that I find most valuable actually about Anti-Oedipus is pointing out the ways in which that kind of symbolic thinking is inevitably reductive in some ways because of the fact that it denies difference, as you point out. Jung is always trying to fit things into an archetype, and I don't think that's an unfair reading because it's quite explicitly his project. I mean, he'll say that all of the, if you're a man, all of the unknown women figures that you encounter in your dreams can ultimately be, sort of confined within the figure of the anima.
Sure.
And that might have multiple faces to it. There might be all sorts of different anime, or I don't know. That's probably anime. That's probably the wrong way to pluralize it, but. At the same time, however, there are definitive characteristics of what the anima means. And regardless of whether it's, the crone, the old woman, or, a siren or a nymph, all of these different symbols that really could be all over the place. It all sort of gets put into this category, which is, from my Nietzschean perspective, there's something very Platonic about that. That I'm very critical of. Yeah, so I think that's one of the most useful things about Anti-Oedipus, and I appreciate their project of attempting to liberate desire from these, I mean, for to put it in a vulgar sense, these boxes, and being critical of why it is that we tend to put desire into these boxes. I very much agree with what you were saying in terms of counterbalancing Jung and Freud and Deleuze and Guattari. The passage that always comes up in my mind with that is Nietzsche's Journey to Hades, where he talks about the 8 thinkers that he will allow the right of judgment over his ideas. and allow them to judge one another. And it's like two pairs of thinkers that or four pairs of thinkers rather. Everywhere he goes, every idea he thinks of, he sort of checks them with all of these different figures. And there's no reconciliation between them. There's no reconciliation between Plato and Rousseau. And yet, and that's, perhaps what Deleuze would say is the resolutely anti-Hegelian nature of Nietzsche's thought is that you can hold the contradiction in your mind without ever arriving at this, well, we have to sublate it somehow. We have to reconcile it somehow. Accepting there may actually just be a true dichotomy here. And there can also be value in mutually exclusive positions, which may sound irrational, but it's only irrational if you're, considering truth from this Platonic framework where there cannot be mutually exclusive truths. And so, yeah, I think that is the immense value of Anti-Oedipus, especially as regards their critique of psychoanalysis and Jung. The desiring production idea, a lot of people would say that there's a clear influence from Nietzsche in his will to power. And this kind of ties in with the idea of the unconscious, almost like that we're desiring machines, that it's a productive process.
Right.
Could you maybe help people work through the ways in which that's different from Nietzsche's will to power, how it builds upon his idea of will to power, how it informs? Because I feel like a lot of my audience is already going to be very familiar with the will to power concept and the way that Nietzsche talks about it, sort of that we're a multiplicity of drives that each has their own quanta of reason. That to me sounds very much in keeping with what the conclusions that Deleuze and Guattari come to. But how do you think about this relationship?
The first thing that does come to mind is the presence of the concept of the body without organs in the discussion of desiring production. And maybe that's something unique to Deleuze and Guattari, at least if we're to think about desiring production in terms of the will to power, then we have to ask, for example, if we are materialists about it, and especially if we're thinking in terms of the production of economic values, economic effects, global effects, social values, and so forth. The totality of those things in Deleuze and Guattari's framework requires conceptually what they call this sort of non-productive aspect, which is the body without organs. And gosh, this could be just we could probably spend the rest of the time talking about the body
Yeah.
without organs. But I would say the short version is this, and it's easy to understand once you put it in these terms. When we think of capital, for example, money, cash, or just the number in our bank account, that in and of itself doesn't do anything. Like if I lay cash on the table, that doesn't wash the dishes, that doesn't pull the gadget off the assembly line, right? But there is something about money, just the presence of money, the ontological entity of money that makes production flow. And it's capital that's also an attractor. And as Deleuze and Guattari say, and I'll try to make it as simple as possible here, is that one of the things that capital as a body without organs tries to do is it projects this illusion that all production in the social field must relate back to capital. While clearly, I mean, there are forms of production that we could imagine that aren't necessarily, they don't have like a direct line back to the production of capital. Maybe a grub turning underneath the earth out in my backyard. But we could also say that under global capitalism, just given the profuse nature of this productive apparatus, it has an almost cosmic effect. So even the detritus being projected out from the factories and then landing on that soil is going to impact the turning of that grub somehow. So there is a way in which all of the productive effects of capitalism will fall back on the sphere of productive activity. And then what capital is trying to do is search out ways to monetize and commodify those sorts of things. And I don't know, I mean, just off the top of my head, I don't think there's an analog in Nietzsche's will to power that really encompasses that idea. I mean, you're the expert.
Right. Well, I would say, yeah, Marx talks about that a little bit, right? That the idea of capital becoming an almost like autonomous entity unto itself in a way. That's sort of, it has its own logic that's inhuman, that not to think about capital as though it's just a bunch of free agents making free decisions. At the same time, that is like an idea in people's heads to some extent.
Mhm.
right? It's a quantification of value that we've all agreed to utilize or something like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think yeah, where I see the connection with Nietzsche and say the body without organs, I guess it would be the see. I think Nietzsche would put it very differently than Deleuze and Guattari do, but I think like maybe coming at it from a different direction, he comes to the same place of questioning this idea of the self as a I don't know. I know you have a background with, as you said, like Buddhism and Taoism, but as this sort of like coherent, stable, unitary thing
Right.
that can be defined in that way. And that if the self is a multiplicity, you could really well make the argument that the drives within you are almost like autonomous subpersonalities. And maybe what I appreciate about the Deleuzian approach is that Jung could take that information and say, well, they're archetypes and
Mhm.
they're this universal sort of set of symbols or ideals, whatever they might be, that are found in every human consciousness and the collective unconscious. Whereas I think Deleuze would resolutely say, no, they're not. And in fact, the archetype within one person isn't even the archetype within another person.
Mm.
There is this essential metaphysical cleaving to difference in Deleuze, which is probably the thing that I like most about him because it's the postmodern element of Nietzsche that's like an undercurrent to all of Nietzsche's thought that makes it very difficult to tangle with many of his ideas. I mean, I posted about this on Twitter the other day that a lot of people will talk about Nietzsche's will to power, but they won't talk about the passages where he says, well, will is just a conflation of multiple concepts under which a popular prejudice lurks.
Mm.
So
Mhm.
even the will to power, when people try to use that as like a monistic sort of principle in the way that Schopenhauer does, it's not really getting to the bottom of what Nietzsche's talking about when he's talking about will to power. It's not saying, well, actually, all of these drives are deep down, they are will to power, and that's some sort of like substance or essence. It's like a way that he's saying that the drives, or we might say each force in the world, relates to one another,
Mm.
these relationships of tension. He's not positing an essence to them in that way. So I always kind of have looked at, and again, Anti-Oedipus is such it can be a very confusing work, and I'm by no means an expert on the text, but that's kind of how I understand the body without organs as a self without an essence,
Mhm.
where all of those different desires, and I do mean different in the Deleuzian sense, sort of have their play.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things that I could say to that. I mean, they develop the concept of a body without organs somewhat differently between different texts. So in Anti-Oedipus, they talk about the territorial machine, the despotic machine that we see under feudalism, and then, of course, the body without organs that is capital. But then when we get into A Thousand Plateaus and the chapter entitled, or the plateau entitled, How Do You Make Yourself a Body Without Organs? Now they're reflecting on the ethic, the sort of from a revolutionary standpoint, how is it that we can utilize this concept then to creatively effectuate the sorts of changes that pull us out of this tendency, to use your language, to put things into boxes, to see ourselves as categories and so forth. And a concept that they highlight is one called creative involution. And this is something that we focused on in our book Anti-Oculus, because I mean, essentially I think the concept is very closely tied to how one makes oneself a body without organs. There's a really easy way to explain it. So, like in medical parlance, an involution refers to, for example, if you have an organ removed, the other organs in your body will kind of move into the space where that organ was and resituate themselves so that they can continue their functioning in a way that's adaptable. A creative involution is when we intentionally look for that element in an organization where we essentially decapitate it. We take the head out, or the organizing logic, so that the disparate elements are freed up. And then what we can do is go about a creative procedure to reassemble them in a manner akin to an emergent desire or a becoming that's suppressed in some way. However you want to think about it. Now we're talking about the issue of repression again, or you know, desire as something emergent or not yet fully fledged. But there are ethical and political implications to that for Deleuze and Guattari. I think you're right to point out that even the concept of multiplicity, there is this tendency of the imperious notion of the self to kind of surf in and want to say, oh, you're talking about multiplicity. I know all about it being a big self. I am that which encompasses all multiplicity. And I think a lot of the critiques of Deleuze and Guattari want to make recourse to this notion of totalizing unities and so forth. And I think while I tend to err on the side of Deleuze and Guattari, one of the reasons that I do that is this sort of ingrained tendency to seek out unities. But and this is not to say that Deleuze or Deleuze and Guattari don't think of unity or have their own way of understanding it. So, for example, in Proust and Signs, one of the useful ways that Deleuze thinks about the concept of unity, that unity from an experiential standpoint is this kind of consummating effect. And he often talks about the non-philosophical precursors to a philosophical thought. Deleuze believes that philosophy comes from the outside, that there's a sort of violence, right? That we're interrupted somehow, or we're unsettled in a way that forces us to think. This can be political violence, it could be a romantic breakup or something like that. In fact, to go back to my biography, one of the reasons that I dove into Taoism the first time was after my first high school breakup. The interesting thing that Deleuze says is that the act of philosophizing, the act of creating a concept, comes about in virtue of these non-philosophical ruptures. And I just thought that was like a really beautiful way to put philosophy. And it's in those movements a kind of tentative unity is formed. But of course, the act of thinking is something that's always going to remain open to a kind of outside. And this is one of the risks of thinking unity, is that these totalizing concepts will foreclose upon the quote unquote whole by presupposing itself as a whole.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's a lot to be said about Nietzsche talking about philosophy being an involuntary, unconscious autobiography, and the germ out of which the entire philosophy springs. I guess you could say it's the arboreal nature of philosophy is, as Deleuze would criticize it, as opposed to rhizomatic, right? Maybe that is the attempt to grab onto that unity, which, I would say it's illusory, and I think that's a brilliant insight as well, that philosophy always comes from sort of an external rupture. Chiron makes a similar point, right? That we're philosophizing because we're unhappy, and so in many ways. But let's get on to talking about Eraserhead. I think we've kind of laid the groundwork, and so we both rewatched it recently.
Yes.
I've seen the film 3 or 4 times. It's not my favorite David Lynch movie, but as David Lynch himself says, it's his most spiritual film. And when asked to elaborate why, he said no. I have to admit, when I first saw Eraserhead, it's so uncomfortable and disgusting in many ways that I almost didn't want to go back and revisit it. Whereas even his really disturbing films like Mulholland Drive has some very disturbing moments. Lost Highway has some very disturbing moments. But even the horror of some of those films didn't really knock me off kilter the way that Eraserhead did.
Yeah.
And so I've had to grow to appreciate it over the years. It's, an acquired taste of a movie. Part of why I wanted to bring this up is because there does seem to be, if not an outright Deleuzian connection, and maybe you could speak to this because some people have speculated about it, a sort of anti-Oedipal nature to the film in, we'll just say the vulgar sense, in the fact that the film doesn't conform itself to that Oedipal notion of desire. It certainly doesn't conform itself to, it doesn't present a world in which desire is seeking after the family life or any of those traditional roles. I guess I'll kick it over to you. What are your initial kind of remarks about Eraserhead?
Well, I thought a lot about this since we decided to do this podcast. And now it's time to bring in Nietzsche, because I think in making the connection between Eraserhead and Anti-Oedipus, I think we are putting ourselves in front of what both Deleuze and Lynch would see as one of the biggest traps in terms of approaching a film, which is a kind of solid, resonant interpretation that seems to be the right one, or seems to be so resonant as to preclude a different kind of understanding of the film. And so, just to go back to your comment about the famous quote slash meme of David Lynch saying, "This is you've said this is your most spiritual film. Could you elaborate on that?" No. One of the reasons is that Lynch was very much opposed to fishing around for the kind of meaning that we could clamp onto. In fact, I have a quote here that I pulled from Lynch that I thought was great. He says, "As soon as you put things into words, no one ever sees the film the same way. And that's what I hate, talking. It's real dangerous." And so I think there's a caveat when approaching Lynch's films, even from what seems to be the most enlightened angle, which is, this Deleuzian and, film analysis, is that we can, find ourselves back in this eddy of interpretosis, as Deleuze might call it, like where our main connection with the film is a kind of interpretation. Because I think what Lynch wants out of the film is he wants us to be in the space of the dream. If you read his book, and actually you can get it on audiobook, I think I prefer it that way, is Catching the Big Fish. Have you listened or read that?
I know about Lynch's metaphor of catching the big fish. I've seen some interviews where he talks about it, but I have not read that book.
Well, the audiobook's excellent. The book is excellent.
Is it read by Lynch?
Yeah, it's read by Lynch.
Oh,
And
okay, good.
that's why you should get it.
Right.
But and there's a funny story to that too. I was like driving across country, and you know how they have those like if there's like an old department store like a Walmart that failed, and then what they do is they have like just they make it into like a discount store where there's a bunch of books and children's toys. I
Mhm.
remember they had like the most massive pallet of CDs of Catching the Big Fish for like $5 a piece. And it was like 20 years ago at a time where, this is, we didn't have we didn't have social media the same way that we do now. And if I was just imagining, if I had that like raft of CDs right now, you could probably like sell them for like 35 bucks each. But anyway, yeah. So I think one of the things that he repeats in Catching the Big Fish is that he has this line that he says all the time where he's like, I just love to be set dreaming. And then, when I encounter an image, he gets in that headspace of the dream. And I think that's a place where he wants us to be. He wants us to be in this more sensate, and even that can be reductive too. I think the word dream is really what encompasses it for Lynn. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and there's even there's kind of an asterisk on that though, because a
Yeah.
lot of people have often put it to Lynch that his films are dreamlike, or that do you get ideas from your dreams? And he has always said, I don't get any ideas from my actual dreams.
Right.
But there's another interview that I recall from him where he says he's talking about how the film is a visual medium. I don't remember his exact words, so I'm paraphrasing that. Film is a visual medium, and what's going on the screen is evocative on its own. And a lot of times, what he wants to portray is something incredibly abstract that doesn't fit into like a traditional narrative where everything makes sense, and it's dreamlike in that way. And that dream logic is not waking logic. But as Lynch puts it, we have this wonderful thing called intuition.
Oh, pretty good.
You know, but and that even if you don't quote unquote consciously understand it, I mean, like, what does that mean from a Nietzschean angle? As Nietzsche says that our best virtues, or what is best about us, what's most profound about us, is completely inexpressible in conscious language. He makes a similar critique of talking as David Lynch does, that you're confining what is absolutely unique into these word concepts that kind of rush to the lowest common denominator, what's comprehensible to everyone, and which is what is a word concept? It's you're creating a signifier for what is ultimately a sense impression, and then expecting that what that signifier will be interpreted to mean will actually reference the same sense impressions in another person, which you have no idea of knowing that. And so, to maybe draw on Wittgenstein a bit, what a word really means is what other people say it means. What everyone, it's not just, oh, I see a tree, it's obviously a tree. It's like, that's what other people call a tree. And so we've all agreed it's convention in that way. And so, I 100% understand the caution around that. Lynch basically has always been very resistant to this kind of, analysis of his films, that of the type that we maybe mentioned earlier, of like, well, we could go through and say, like, what does the woman in the radiator symbolize, right? And that would sort of presume that there is like an attached word concept to what that symbolizes, when really it's supposed to hit on your intuition and conjure something that you almost can't put into words, but I mean, we're obviously going to try to use words to describe how we feel about the film. But I would say, like a movie like Eraserhead, just talking about my initial reaction to it, the sort of like, it's a very confining, almost claustrophobic film in many ways. And
Mhm.
the whole landscape is so, it's almost post apocalyptic in a sense.
Oh,
And
yeah.
all of that, you could interpret what all of that means, but the emotional reality of that you experience is sort of undeniable. There's almost nothing to say about it beyond that. The experience that people have seeing the film, they could say, "Oh, I didn't understand that at all rationally." But I would contend there is an emotional, or maybe emotional is even too narrow a word, an intuitive reality that you're being exposed to when you see that film, or really any of his films, that I think is undeniable and unmistakable. It's very, for example, if somebody said that it came away from Eraserhead saying, well, I found that to be a lighthearted comedic romp, you'd be like, we didn't see the same film. Now that doesn't mean there's not funny elements to Eraserhead. There's actually some hilarious bits in that movie, as there are in all of David Lynch's films. But even that in and of itself, that sort of like blending of things that are funny and scary in the same scene is very dreamlike, kind of in the sense that you were talking about earlier as well. And so I don't know. I guess I would say, like, how do we proceed with an analysis of the film then, without falling into that sort of Deleuzian trap? Is it by kind of looking to what intuition tells us, or
Good question. I mean, maybe to restate the problem, or when you had hit me up to come on the podcast to talk about this, one of the first things that came to mind was my first encounter with Deleuze's Nietzsche, because when Deleuze works with Nietzsche, he's not out to create something that mirrors Nietzsche in a way that resembles his work. What he's doing is he's internalizing the creativity and the axioms of Nietzsche's method and deploying them in a way that's unique in its own right. And it made me think, like, how does one go about then having a high-minded conversation about David Lynch's work without deferring to metaphors, interpretations, and how does one encounter the film and then generate a response that then honors Lynch's sort of implicit mandate, not mandate, but injunction, or his command of sorts is like, hey, dive into your dreams, like find a way to get to that place and just be in the beauty of it. And then I know at the end we'll talk about my experience when I was on Inland Empire, but when we were debriefing on the days that I was on the set, he we would just sit with Lynch, you know, with all the craft food services there, eating some of the best food I had in a while because I was poor when living in Hollywood. But one of the things that he would do is he would just ask people to talk about things that kind of stood out to them, that sort of poked out, things that they liked, whether it was about the scene itself or even the way that the production went was quite important to him. And sort of centering his focus on these diverse aesthetic elements, not just the film, not just the content, not just the story, but just way things were happening on set too was seemed quite important to him. But going back to, like, how do we talk about it? I mean, at least the one thing that I took away from my first encounters with Lynch was it was something that made me want to change my life. I don't know about you. I encountered it, like, in my early 20s, but, just seeing this unique creative genius play out in a certain way, and especially at a time where I was having weird dreams and seeing that messed up dream from Winky's Diner in Mulholland Drive. You know what I mean? Like the resonance or the coincidence of those two events in my life, like, really got me thinking, like, this is the juice. There's something important here that he's pointing to that I should at least make some of my life about, like like to find a way either artistically, creatively, philosophically to occupy this space and make time for it, seems to be important, which is something that I think I have honored somewhat, at least, by my own standards anyway. And so, I mean, even doing this conversation and relaying that fact about myself to you, and maybe others will hear it, maybe they'll have, it sort of generates a conversation about like what should or what can a film do to you,
Yeah.
you know?
No, and I think, another thing that Lynch has said is about the whole talking about his movies is that the talking is up there on the screen in some sense
Mm.
already. And then I think that's probably the right way to approach it. The way you're talking about is all you can really do is talk about how it sits with you or what you experienced. What do you think? What did I feel like the film was conveying to me? I think that, I mean, well, so with Eraserhead, particularly talking about the whole element of like his movies wanting to make you change your life, I probably experienced that most strongly with Eraserhead than any
Oh,
of his other
interesting.
films. Even
Wow.
though it's always been one that like I always had kind of like an ugh reaction to that movie, which I think is very normal. What I experienced out of it is a fear of almost like a fear of being complacent in a situation that you feel like you can't get out of because of, I mean, just to put it in concrete terms of the film, inexplicably you have a baby with Mary.
Right.
They're not even sure it is a baby, as the line goes. But no, it's a baby, and you have to take care of it. It's this dismal, horrifying experience that the characters are sort of trapped in. The main character is so Henry is
Henry.
so he's so yeah he's so timid and so he's almost like out of place in the industrial hellscape that he lives in because he seems so good natured in a sense. And obviously with to bring in biographical details of the author, which some would not like, but Lynch has said that he had a lot of anxiety about having his daughter, and that she had like kind of a deformity as well. I wouldn't take that super literally that was the literal horror that he was experiencing was on par with Eraserhead. But I think there is that sort of like horror of parenthood, and I wouldn't know this because I'm not a parent, but that it's obviously a thing of great joy for a lot of people. But I've many of my friends who are parents have talked about that moment where, oh, you just took the kid home from the maternity ward or whatever, and it hits you that you are responsible for this life, and there's no one else that you can, you might have people who can help you, but at the end of the day, the buck stops with you, and you have this like incredibly delicate and fragile thing. There are so many things like that in life where you're sort of locked in through decisions that you made, or maybe decisions that you didn't make, decisions that you felt happened to you, or that you weren't active in determining your destiny, and now you're in this situation.
It made me think something that may or may not be true, which is I wonder if the film, you're talking about Lynch and his relationship with his daughter. I wonder if Lynch had an unconscious or subconscious trepidation about the ways in which maybe having a child would have affected his creativity and his capacity to dive deep in the way that he wants to, because the one thing that the baby does is there's this incessant whining, right?
Yeah.
That art
And that's
for
his daughter's voice, by the way. The
oh,
actual sound effect that they use are his daughter as a baby.
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that I found out about this film over the past few days. For example, this film came as a complete script when they filmed it, whereas there were no leaks of the Mulholland Drive or Inland Empire script, because it's understood that they knew when they were filming specific scenes what they were doing, but I think Lynch somewhat improvised as he was going with those films, as I understand it. Now, I could be wrong. This is just one of the sources, but I think, when we think about this sort of narrative fragmentation that characterizes Lynch's films, particularly the late ones, that's not the case with Eraserhead. There's an understood continuity from front to back, as he's producing.
Right. Well, except for the whole thing with the head becoming a racer. There's kind of like a little vignette, I guess, in the middle of that whole like dreamlike
Oh,
sequence, but mostly.
is that added after the original
Oh
script?
no, 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 no! I was just saying in terms of it's not a fragmentary script in that way. I wasn't really referring to the process so much, just of the fact that Inland Empire, it's not entirely clear to me what happened in the movie, like from a narrative standpoint.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
Right.
Whereas Eraserhead, it's perfectly clear. There's only like one or two areas, like the man, the man in the moon, and or the man in the planet, rather. The little vignette in the middle. For the most part, people say they don't comprehend David Lynch's films. You can pretty much say all the events that happened in that movie, and it's pretty easy to understand. Like you could write it out, and it would make perfect sense to most people. Maybe not make sense in terms of the way things happen in the actual world, but from you mentioned Kafka earlier. From a Kafka-esque standpoint, it's not any more or less incomprehensible than say Metamorphosis. One day you're a vermin, right? And you have to deal with that outcome.
You know,
But yeah.
actually doing a bit of writing right now for maybe you remember we did a Kickstarter for that the George Bataille tarot, the erotic tarot of George Bataille, and there's a book that goes with it for which we're doing some essays. And after having watched Eraserhead, I decided to include a paragraph or two about the connection between Lynch and Kafka, particularly in Eraserhead. Like one of the images that stood out to me this time, talking about the industrial hellscape, is there's so much movement through, you know, black holes and white holes in Eraserhead. There's this shifting of levels. There's a kind of spatiality to Lynch's films that we need to reckon with, which I think connect to his desire and impulse to transcend, and thinking about levels of consciousness. Perhaps that's a possible interpretation. But the one thing that Henry cannot surpass is his workplace. If you remember the beginning of the film,
Mm.
there's that sort of like cosmic birth, where that like spermatozoa baby like flies out of his mouth. And then you see that sort of like leprous figure behind the window, the man in the planet. And then the next thing, he's just sort of ambling the landscape of this factory or whatever, and we're made to think. I think that there's a consensus, in terms of like the reviews and interpretations of the film, that that is Henry's place of work, but there's no way for him to get in. And one of the funny things is he's meant to be on vacation, which I just think is hilarious because that's like the absolute worst vacation anyone can imagine. He has this baby mysteriously and so forth. But I likened it to the way in which Kafka, especially in his short stories like Before the Law and The Imperial Message, where there's this sort of like incessant kind of ambling or travel and never reaching one's destination. And, when I think about, let's imagine there's a Marxist interpretation of the film. Of all the passages that Henry can go through, the one that he cannot pass into is into the place of work, into the place, like into the literal factory, whether that's the factory, in economic terms, or whether that's the factory of the sort of Lynchian dream world. That is a body without organs in Anti-Oedipus. It would be well, I mean, technically a factory is something that produces something, but it's the thing that the desiring forces cannot break into. That's the one thing that's the one barrier in the film that Henry seems not to be able to surpass. I just thought that was an
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah.
No, that is really interesting, and also you were talking about sort of ambling around and not getting anywhere in Kafka. I think my favorite Kafka story is The Castle,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that's what that was what makes me think of it as the. But yeah, I had not thought about that element of Eraserhead. He can't get into his place of work. Also, I mean, what do you think about? Because I was kind of thinking about it with the whole just coming to mind imagery of like productive forces and industrialism and everything. That the dinner scene where they eat these man-made chickens that are just totally disturbing. People can read into that, again, from like the lore of the film. Does this imply there's been some sort of post-apocalypse where people have had to create their man-made food that's artificial in this way? I don't know. It's another one of those things where I almost hesitate to give it a sort of like coherent, rational example, and I can only speak to like how I experienced it or what my intuition is telling me about it. That there's something, the fact that that's the scene where he's meeting with his mother and father-in-law, and with his, young wife, and the thing in the center that's supposed to nourish them is this sort of like disgusting, artificially created, like it just calls to mind the idea, if we're going with, again, like sort of looking at it from a Deleuzian lens, and I'm thinking about like desiring and food being an object of desire, of the sort of, just on the most basic level of like hedonic pleasure for many people. I mean, again, going back to like maybe like a Marxist look at society, for many people that might be one of their only pleasures at the end of the day, right? And that's been sort of subsumed in this world and turned into something that's sort of, for lack of a better word, unnatural and just off-putting, off-kilter.
It's as if it's a spurious form of nourishment. And here's just something strange that comes to mind. The Eraserhead was filmed in the 1970s, and I was born in, when was the film made? 77, right? Or
Yeah,
79? Yeah, I was born in 1977, so I'm showing my age here. But I mean, I can even remember in the early 80s as a young kid, just the anxieties around industrial produced food, Swanson TV dinners, and the coming to pass of the traditional American family meal with real food products in it and so forth. And now I think we live in a society where it's a foregone conclusion. We're going to eat red hot Cheetos and Takis and all sorts of
sure,
crap.
yeah.
And so I wonder if some of those anxieties about the inauthenticity about the production of objects for consumption enters in there a little bit. And then, that's then a reflection on the Oedipal family in some sense.
Well, and the fact that the mother seems to have like almost, it seems at first like she's maybe horrified, but then it also could be orgasmic. She has this very strange reaction when he's like cutting the chicken. And then, of course, after that, tries to like come on to Henry.
Mm. And she has
Um,
that sort of like orgasmic moment on the couch too that goes unexplained.
right. And the Mary's father is completely like oblivious to this the
Mm.
entire time. And really, it's a lot of those scenes that, to me, I don't know, struck at those anti-Oedipal elements or something like that, because there's no, how would you put
Well,
it?
just another point on food too. I'm remembering. Do you remember the scene in the kitchen where the mom, Mrs. X, is she's preparing the salad, but then she puts the salad bowl on the grandmother's lap, and she's in the catatonic state, right?
Yeah.
And she basically puppets the grandmother through the motions of mixing the salad, and it made me think that I like, what are we trying to say here is that even the figure of the family, the matriarch, is a simulacrum, right? And the kind of um, you know activities or responsibilities that are imparted to her are spurious ones, right? Like it's the mom actually doing it. And so yeah, there's this sort of connection between inauthenticity and food and just consumption in general.
Well, yeah, that's like the typical sort of, that's what a family is supposed to do, is sit down for dinner, and especially in the American context, And that it is almost like a scene where every familial role is somehow misplaced, and not in a way that might be said like, you could say that I'm trying to think of how to put this. Like, the father figure is not, you could say that, for example, let's look at Twin Peaks.
Mhm.
You could take that as a criticism of the patriarchal father figure. And God, I don't want to spoil Twin Peaks for anybody. It has been out for like 30 fucking years at this point. So, I think everyone knows who killed Laura Palmer. But there's sort of like, again, an implicit critique there of, perhaps that traditional nuclear family structure has, you could read it as like there's a dark, seedy underbelly to it that is destructive and, you might say, like Saturn eating his children,
Absolutely.
that kind of imagery. Eraserhead is an almost more abstract. If you want to take it as a critique on the family, it's almost far more abstract than that, because you don't have like a strong father figure or a devouring father figure. You don't have an absent father figure. You have a father figure who's like absent and present at the same time, who seems completely unemotionally affected by anything that's going on. He's not. It doesn't seem like he's trying to control the situation. It doesn't seem like there's, and then the mother figure who sort of blends together with, like, we might say, to draw on the Jungian anima, like sort of in that way is like blurring together with what a love interest might be for the main character rather than his mother-in-law. And then the grandmother, the matriarch, is, as you say, is like a simulacrum. And then normally you have like the story in the typical failed, marriage or relationship story would be the father leaves, right? That's the more typical thing that happens. With this is a film where the mother leaves. The guy is left stuck with taking care of the child. Everything's mismatched, I think, is a good enough way to put it.
I love the Mr. X, the father figure, and the scene where we're introduced to him. In as much as this is a fictional portrayal, I think Lynch does capture in the geometry of the household and the father's presentation of himself a kind of awkwardness that you get when you're introduced to families that aren't your own sometimes, or
Yeah,
maybe
it's surreal and real at the same time is what he really achieves. But yes, sorry, go on.
No, I mean that's basically it. And I love there's just very interesting subtle details like in that frame. I think it's in the upper left-hand corner. There's like a massive piece of black ductwork that comes through. Like nobody would have that in their home unless had like a workshop or a garage or something. And it just interferes with the frame just enough to have the father recede even further into the background. If you remember, he's kind of like in the weird dining room space, but the dining room table set like a desk and it's spotlit. And he's
Mm-hmm.
yelling from across the dining room into the living room receiving area, like when Henry shows up for the first time.
Just an observation that came to mind. A lot of what Lynch does, it captures a very real moment that's very, again, I'm almost struggling to put it into words. There are moments in his films where you can say, wow, I've experienced something just like that, even though what the literal text of the film is nothing like anyone's ever experienced. And I think of, again, Mr. X, sort of bragging about how his what is he bragging about? Work, or the way he's sort of like topic that he's focusing on. So I've installed every pipe in this town, basically.
And
Um,
as he's doing it, you hear the pipe noise coming in and it's drowning him out because the mother and the daughter just aren't listening to him, which I thought was a brilliant.
right. Well, and it's also like you could read that as like that's what he is in some sense. Like he's become a function. I don't know, and he's proud of being a function. Something like that. So there's a picture in Henry's apartment, and that's one of the details that I noticed on this last rewatch that I never really noticed of a nuclear explosion. And again, you could like sort of read that literally as in the lore of the film, but I can't help but think about what Lynch has said in relation to his other work, particularly like Twin Peaks season three. There was a shift in the zeitgeist, a kind of fear that was like released into the air, a thing in the air, as Lynch calls it, that he kind of ties to the atomic nuclear tests. And you see that in Twin Peaks: The Return, in the most abstract episode, also in almost entirely in black and white, where Judy, this sort of malevolent force, potentially enters the world during the Trinity nuclear tests. And so I was kind of thinking about that when seeing, like, why does he have a picture of that on the wall in his apartment? The pervasiveness of like this just underlying fear in the whole film, but also the fact that that's an aesthetic in his apartment. Normally, like something you're going to put up in your apartment is going to be something that you want to look at.
The things that I picked up on this time were one that I mean, it's just so obvious, but we haven't talked about it. There's no crib for the baby. It's just like sitting on the dresser, like, just throw your keys and wallet there and the baby. And that's something that I thought was interesting. But this time around, the one thing that really stood out to me was, okay, so there's all these like spermatozoic, maybe mini Eraserhead babies that appear in his mattress. I mean, we see the very first one at the beginning of the film. It's almost like this cosmic event where, you have this diaphanous image of Henry floating in space. He opens his mouth and one of these things comes shooting out of it. It's almost like a creation myth of sorts. But there's also a moment where, if you remember, where he finds one, I think it's in the bed, he finds her on the floor, and he picks it up and he puts it in this thing on the wall that almost looks like a little tabernacle.
Hmm.
And it made me think that, when we think of sperm, for example, I mean, it's a multiplicity, but he takes this singular, spermatozoic larvae or whatever you want to call it, which I mean, if you want to talk about Deleuze and Guattari subjectivity, the concept of larval subjects, here we have a larval subject, but one that's been utterly isolated and placed in this sort of like tabernacle like structure and just left alone. And to me, that's like the entire microcosm of the film is having this singular entity just kind of shuttered in to this quasi spiritual object that's like in his bedroom. And then later on, when he opens it up, we have this little claymation segment where the thing's just writhing in pain. And when it opens his mouth, it becomes another one of those portals that Henry dives into.
And not only that, the woman in the radiator is like
Yeah. Yeah.
stepping on the spermatozoas. Basically, they're like raining down, and she's just kind of squashing them like bugs. And some people have interpreted that as her symbolizing like his sexual desire or something like that. Perhaps because it's like a source of comfort for him, and radiators are warm. I don't know. I've always kind of seen it. That song she sings in Heaven, Everything Is Fine.
Right.
It's almost like I feel like Lynch does this a lot where what we're seeing on the screen is almost like a reflection of the inner state of the character, and what is it that's making everything fine is kind of squashing those spermatozoas basically. And of course the end of the film is Lynch loves his use of like electricity and sort of static, and the way that sort of like swells and builds. It's almost like the medium like disintegrating in some way. And you could read that as like a literal ascent to heaven, as in the main character has died or killed himself or something like that. That creation myth at the beginning of the film, which it is very much like speaking the world into existence or something like that. It's almost like a combination of God speaking the world into existence and Amun-Re or Atum-Re and the Egyptian myth masturbating the world into existence. You kind of can have both. That's the beginning of this entire nightmare. Is you could make a phallogocentrism sort of Derridian comment about that. That's the beginning of the nightmare, and then his embrace of the woman in the radiator who crushes the spermatozoa, and the dissolving into the medium dissolving itself is the end of the nightmare. And that's yeah.
I made a weird connection this time around too, and this is just having like Greek myth and stuff on the brain. And I mean, you brought up the term Saturnine here. The man in the planet reminds me of Kronos, and I don't know why. Like this time around, like when I saw it, I'm like, oh, that's Kronos. I mean, it's
It's like
not.
it's demiurgic. Maybe a lot of people associate Kronos with like a demiurge, and it seems like he's pulling the levers behind the scenes, right?
And also the other strange connection this time around is he's the one who has all the warts or abscesses or leprosy or whatever it is that he has on him. And the only other figure to have that in the film is the baby. And it made me think, is that the baby that we see?
Hmm. Right. That's the right, and that's the interesting thing. Another dreamlike quality of Lynch's films is that ag- again, we're violating all the sort
Oh,
of caution that we talked about, but I feel that so often. I talked a lot about this in the psychology and alchemy episodes. How this idea of something being like unto something else, that it's not quite literal, it's not quite a metaphor, it's like a correspondence, and it's a very sort of old way of thinking. And the example Jung uses is like the sanctification of the fire the day before Easter. Like the fire is an imago Christi, it is Christ. The fire is revealing something about the nature of Christ or something like that. And I feel like that goes on a lot. And Jung would say that goes on a lot in dreams. And I feel like it goes on a lot in David Lynch's films, where it's almost like you don't have, where multiple different things almost have, if not the same identity, they're like different reiterative expressions of the theme that's going on in the film. And so it is, if we're taking it like the baby is this thing that sort of like traps you into this suboptimal life situation that you just sort of like blundered your way into. and now you're living this nightmare. From the Gnostic angle, that's what Saturn or Kronos, the demiurge, would do, is trap you in this samsaric reality. And
Mhm.
so maybe there is some sort of identity between the baby and the man and the planet.
And there's maybe another connection that we can make too. When we think of Saturn or Kronos, and Saturnine energies. There's a Saturn is associated with smoldering, depression. I mean, that's the whole context and motif of the film, and maybe even partly the reason why black and white was chosen for the film too. I don't know, but James Hillman often opposes the figure of the puer, the puer aeternus, to the figure of Saturn. And that's the one thing that Henry cannot do. He's not able to enjoy those puer energies. So if we want to take it to a sort of like archetypal analysis here, and it calls into question then the role of the women in Henry's life, of which there are three prominent ones. I mean, we can say the dyad of the mother and Mary, that constitutes one. But then there's the woman across the hall who's the sort of like shadowy kind of Lilith figure. And then we have the dancing woman at the end who might be, I mean, I think maybe all of these, if we were to apply a Jungian lens, are sort of iterations of an anima kind of figure. And it's not until we get into the radiator in the little elevator that goes up or down to the theater that Henry is then able to find his bliss. Ultimately, I think that's the meaning of this film is, finding these lines of escape or lines of flight out of the horrors of the edible tableau in order to find one's bliss. I mean, that to me is like the interpretation that I walked away with this time. But I don't know. What do you think on the anime?
No, that well, and actually, the summary you just gave is something I've been struck. You put it better than I could have. The way that I would read the film, that I was probably unable to articulate, is finding some sort of escape
Mhm.
from that, as you say, that Oedipal milieu or whatever it might be. And there's also, I mean, as you said, you could have a Marxist reading of the film. You could have all sorts of readings of the film of just a general portrayal of the unsatisfactory nature of modernity itself. Yeah, the different anima figures. Yeah, the woman in the radiator has like she's almost like a, I mean, who would she be? Like Sophia or some someone who's sort of taking you up to, yeah, the transcendence, right? That David Lynch is very much interested in. We've been going for a little while here, and I did want to get on to talking a little bit about your experiences on Inland Empire. And it's become clear the more we've talked about Eraserhead that it's kind of impossible to get away from Platonizing or Jungianizing or doing all of that symbolic representational type of analysis. And so maybe it's best we leave it there and move on because, as Nietzsche says, we still believe in God because we still have faith in grammar. Um, and so these word concepts are we're going to keep falling victim to the problems of talking. But that being said, yeah, let's talk about Inland Empire. How did you get that opportunity to go on set?
Yeah. So I think we'll go back to my story about being in Japan first, because there's an arc anyway that got me from these initial dreams that I had in Japan that actually sent me to a Jungian analyst, takes me all the way to David Lynch at the end. And so, as I said, I had these wild dreams, started reading books, and I was able to go see one of the most prominent Jungian analysts in Japan, whose name was Toshio Kawai. And I had several sessions with him. And actually, it was quite cathartic. I mean, just being able to talk to somebody about this sort of, these odd experiences and odd mental content that, I was forced to be burdened with was maybe all I really needed, but it was helpful um, in deeper ways, I imagine too. But it was also around this time that like I started watching Lynch's film, and then of course, seeing the dream sequence in Mulholland Drive. And maybe one thing that I'll say that we didn't mention here is I think that particular vignette. I mean, some people have said that the dream sequence. That happens at Winky's Diner could almost stand alone as a short film, which I mean, clearly it can.
Yeah,
But
I agree.
what that particular scene does for us, I think it gives us just about everything we've been talking about here today. Because, well, let's take a look at it. We have somebody who's in therapy. They're an analysan, presumably, and they're having lunch or breakfast with their therapist. and they want to tell them about a dream, something that's affected them deeply. And they feel a little bit of guilt about it. And so right away, we get a sense of the dynamics between analyst and analysand, a kind of transference thing, and a little bit of shame going on there too. And once he starts telling the dream, that's when we get, the sort of odd rhythm of, Lynch's, sort of cinematic approach to things. But also, as he describes his dream, he's starting to talk about the ambivalences between it, like it's not quite night, it's not quite day, and I see this face, and he's speaking in such like a vague and general way, but it's all about telling at this point. Ultimately, that's what I'm getting to here, is that there's a telling of a dream. And then what happens is the therapist gets up and then he goes to the cash register and then he starts to replay the dream. And at this point, there is no words. The grammar evaporates. And what we do is we play out that dream in its full intensity, having been told about the horrors that await. Yet Lynch, I think the sort of masterful stroke here is that you're getting the jump scare. He's going to give it to you. He told you what it is you're going to see. He walks you all the way through, and it's still like one of the greatest jump scares in history. And what you get, there's a divide between the sort of telling of the dream and the immersion of the dream, which I think that Lynch masterfully captures. And, maybe we can talk about that at the end, but like having noticed that, like that just unsettled me for days upon weeks seeing that scene. And it was at that point I was living in Japan. My visa was going to run out in like, I don't know, a year's time or something like that. And I had to figure out what it was I was going to do with my life. And I really had no idea. I had friends who were living in Hollywood and other parts of Los Angeles who were working in the film and music industry. And I was doing music too. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to go and get up with them and I'm going to do my own kind of Lynchian thing. And so I moved to Hollywood and I lived, for anybody who's listening who's in Los Angeles, I lived off of Santa Monica Boulevard, off of Curson, kind of near, or Gardner, Curson and Gardner, if you know where that is. And that's important because when I moved into my apartment sight unseen after flying back from Japan, the next day I was like, let me go take a walk. And I walked right up Gardner Avenue there. And sure enough, there's Winky's Diner. I live right next to Winky's
Oh,
Diner.
wow.
Yeah. And I was just like, this is
Did you go
incredible.
check behind the diner?
Oh, I had to, of course. Yeah, but yeah. So that was that was an incredible experience. And much like Naomi Watts' character in Mulholland Drive, I had these, as a lot of young people go to Los Angeles do, like, well, I'm going to do something. I'm going to do music. I'm going to do movies. I'm going to be in a David Lynch film. Here I live by Winkies. Literally, like 2 days after, 3 days after moving there, uh, my neighbor came up to me. He's like, "Do you want to be in a David Lynch film?" And I was like, "Yes, I do. I absolutely want to."
Oh
And
my God.
yeah, and he said basically they're just it's like it's word of mouth at this point. It's off of Santa Monica Boulevard. There's a bar called 40 Deuce, and it's essentially like a burlesque bar. And there's a scene you can find me in I'm sorry, in Inland Empire, where I think it's like almost at the 2 hour mark, where there's a burlesque dancer. And yeah, we shot for 2 days, I think it was. And basically there's like 40 of us there, mostly word of mouth, all arrived, and we just sat with David and the crew, filming that burlesque scene. But there was also a scene that was filmed that I didn't see in the film, and maybe it's on like the extended DVD or something like that, but the scene was incredible and I don't know why they cut it. It was just a woman singing. It was reminiscent of Mulholland Drive. And I couldn't find the song, but I think the actual song is on the Inland Empire soundtrack. And it might be David Lynch's own song called Ghosts of Love, because I remember it had like a kind of twang guitar in there, and there's like a sample of like a freight train or a locomotive in the background. But the filming of that and the lighting and everything was just absolutely incredible. And as I said, nobody got paid. Nobody wanted to get paid. It was 2 complete days of unpaid labor, but you got to be in a David Lynch film. I don't think anybody was complaining, but there's craft services. We had a nice lunch afterwards. But the really remarkable thing about the whole experience was being able to sit with David Lynch and him just going round robin, not only to the crew members, but to the extras as well, like kind of asking them, like, what did you think? What stood out to you? And there was a process of sort of consummating that experience where we got to talk about like what was beautiful and what stood out to us. And I think from the standpoint of a producer, I mean, that's not the kind of ethos you ordinarily associate
Yeah.
with like a Hollywood producer, right? And so for someone to have taken that time, I mean, he was really invested in the experience for everybody there that day. And not only that, another thing that really stood out to me about that day was, I mean, the 40 Deuce Bar has this sort of like Hollywood, like old Hollywood sort of traditional LA Americana vibe. And, that's something that these days is highly commodified. I mean, if you like grew up in the late 90s and early 2000s, maybe there was even a sort of resurgence with that, like when everybody was wearing bowling shirts, watching movies like LA Confidential, Things to Do in Denver While You're Dead, like Swingers, like that whole sort of thing that just sort of celebrated the aesthetic of Hollywood, but did it in a way that was kind of kitschy and degrading.
Yeah.
What you really notice about Lynch is he gets inside those figures. I mean, he's putting just flat out archetypal cowboys in his movies,
Yeah.
right? And he's putting starlets and like sort of like Marilyn Monroe lookalikes. And he's using, like maybe in like sort of Deleuze-Guattarian terms, like these molar archetypal figures, but using them in ways that is very unconventional, and it is eliciting like the most sublime of feelings, thoughts, and intensities. And it was really that day where I got to see it, because I'm not really into that aesthetic of like that sort of like West Coast Americana thing, but he just animated it so nicely that day, and that those 2 days, and that's what really stood out to me.
Yeah, I think it speaks to the love that he puts into his productions, that he genuinely loves this stuff. Like that whole aesthetic, I think he genuinely loves it. And I mean, like you talk about like, yeah, there's real life cowboys in his movies. In a lot of ways, David Lynch is kind of like a real life cowboy, growing up on the ranch in Montana or whatever. And I think that also his approach to filmmaking based on his own spirituality, it really
Mhm.
matters what energy you put into making the thing, right? I think when you're talking about like a typical Hollywood producer, it's kind of like it doesn't. What matters is what's up on the screen, right? The final product. You can kind of mistreat people or fuck people over. It doesn't really matter. It can be a cynical cash grab, but at the end of the day, if you put out a blockbuster, it's fine. And Lynch, you can tell, never had that ethos. And then, I mean, just the fact of like how Inland Empire was shot, and they almost like a return to indie filmmaking after, at a point where he could have done whatever he wanted, I think is very admirable as well. And you were talking about a jump scare in Mulholland Drive, and I love that scene. It's not. I guess there is a jump scare at the end, but it's the least scary part of that sequence to me. It's that shot of Laura Dern just walking straight toward the camera with the spotlight on her, just looking straight at the camera. It's one of the most disturbing scenes, and it's like it's amazing that he gets he gets that effect with like a known actress. It's like, hey, that's the actress from Jurassic Park. Like I know who Laura Dern is, and she's just walking towards the screen. She's not doing anything scary, and it's horrifying. And that's the kind of that's the kind of, I'll just use the word genius that he has, that you almost can't put into words why it works a lot of the time, but it
Yeah,
does.
no, I was going back through some scenes in Mulholland Drive in preparation for this, and you recall the scene where they go, it's is it Laura Harring and Naomi Watts, right? They're
Mhm.
both the actors. And of course, there's this whole sort of like doppelganger thing, twin thing going on with them. And when they walk into this bedroom, and they have the blue box with the key, and I think it's Naomi Watts who has it, but then she hands it to Laura Herring's character. And as she's about to turn the key, Naomi Watts just disappears. She's just no longer there. She's gone. And
Yeah.
suddenly the entire space, which is just kind of this claustrophobic bedroom with this closet that's just kind of filled with clothes, and there's just a hallway down the end where she walks into view of that hallway that's completely dark. That hallway was completely innocuous until she disappeared. And just noticing those little gestures that Lynch makes, just adds that much more savor to to his work.
Yeah. Well, Craig, it's been great. Oh, man, I can't believe we didn't talk about with Eraserhead. The baby is a body with organs. You definitely see them all at the when he
But he
carves them out.
does kind of implode at the end, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah. Just almost again disintegrating. Like, ugh. Yeah. Don't take off the bandages. It was a mistake. But yeah, I've had a lot of fun talking about this. I feel like again struggled with some of the words, but that's the nature of the material here, and it's not easy to order your thoughts about a David Lynch film. I've had a great time. It's been my pleasure. Before we kind of sign off here, do you have anything you want to plug that you're working on, or just anything you want to shout out?
Sure. So I would just say add to your rotation the Acid Horizon podcast. Like I said,
And Left Hand.
and Left Hand. Yeah. So we'll throw those in your show notes or something like that. And I have to say, I listen. I have about 10 to 12 podcasts in the rotation, including the Nietzsche podcast. And I always look forward to, hearing Keegan's creamy baritone come through. So I hope there's something similar to that, for you in Acid Horizon or Left Hand. This year, one of the things that we're doing is we are doing a philosophical investigation of fascism from different angles on the podcast. And with Left Hand coming up, well, one of the next episodes that listeners might appreciate is I am going to talk about through the work of Rafael Lopez Pedraza whether or not Dionysus is in exile, if we have repressed Dionysus in our lives. So that should be something for the ears of the Nietzsche podcast listeners.
All right. Well, hopefully you liberate Dionysus or bring him back. I think we need him more than ever. We need you, buddy. All right, Craig, thank you. It's been my pleasure. We're signing off.
Believe it or not, Eraserhead is my most spiritual film.
Elaborate on that.
No, I won't.
If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.